Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's had a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragonsjewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan, and I'm just gonna get all that wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way first. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so, just down below. If you like the content you see, don't forget to give a like. And of course, any love, comments, suggestions, all those wonderful things, there's a comment section down there as well for all of that. Today we are diving back into the Ghostly Echoes series. We had been working our way through British Columbia, so now we are going east. We're skipping over Alberta because we already did that one, and we are diving into the ghost stories of Saskatchewan. So I hope you guys enjoy these next few spooky tales. This story takes place south of Regina, Saskatchewan. Hide and Shriek. A man named Lowell spent most of the summers of his childhood on his grandparents' farm south of Regina. Lowell's parents found that sending their 3 children to the farm was an excellent alternative to pricey childcare in the city, as well as a chance for the kids to stretch their legs, breathe country air, and bond with the only grandmother and grandfather that they had. Lowell and his brother and sister had a different point of view. However, they found the summers unbearably long. They were separated from their parents and friends, trapped in what they felt was a hopelessly dull environment, and forced to live with the rules and company of an elderly couple with whom they never forged a close or loving relationship. The days and weeks seemed unbearably long, and Lowell, in particular, retained few fond memories of those times. At best, it was just incredibly boring, he recalled. At worst, it could be pretty unpleasant. My grandfather would get into his head that we were disrespectful or lazy or whatever, and we'd be lined up against the kitchen wall. We'd have to face the wall and keep our noses touching it, and keep perfectly still until he thought we'd learn whatever lesson this was supposed to teach us. Grandmother wasn't much better, but mostly she just ignored us unless we had to be corrected over our manners or the way we did our chores. The 3 children tried to stay out of the house and out of the way as much as possible. They played in the barn and other outbuildings when the weather was fine, and in the dark, damp basement of the house when it was raining. It was during such a cold, rainy day in the summer of 1972 that Lowell had an experience that he was neither forgotten nor been able to explain to this day. It began with a simple game that the children played in the basement. The basement of that old house was pretty gross, said Lowell. Almost more of a cellar. It was used for storage, so it was all shelves and boxes with a few closets built against the wall where my grandmother would keep her canned preserves. Nothing was ever cleaned down there, so we just kept filthy with dust when we played. That meant catching hell once, but it was better than trying to play upstairs, where we'd get ragged on all day long. Anyway, because it was so cluttered and filled with junk, it meant that there was a lot of places to hide. Because of that, hide and seek was usually the activity of choice in the basement. On the particular day that Lowell remembers, he was on a lucky streak. He had found so many effective hiding places that he hadn't once been tagged it. The kids were playing their 4th round of the game when he discovered what he thought to be the best spot of all. It was like a big old pantry cupboard that had been pushed into one corner. It had shelves in it that went about 2/3 of the way down, but the bottom part was just one big space. I was only 9 years old, and I wasn't that big, so I could squeeze into the bottom of the cupboard and pull the door shut with my fingernails. It was absolutely pitch black in there, and like an oven, but I knew my brother and sister would never find me. Lowell had discovered that when he was inside the antique cupboard, he couldn't hear very well what was taking place outside the heavy wooden doors. He would simply have to make sure that the others had ample time to give up before he revealed his hideout. For several minutes he waited patiently, giving his sister, who was it, plenty of time to find his younger brother. The muscles in his leg cramped in objection to the uncomfortable position. Lowell shifted his aching limbs one at a time, making use of the few spare inches he had. Trickling lines of sweat began to course down his neck and back. Something likely a spider made its feathery way up his leg. Still, Lowell remained determinedly quiet, waiting for enough time to pass. Finally, I figured it was long enough. They must have given up. So I went to push the doors open, but they wouldn't move. Lowell leaned into the heavy wooden panels with his thin shoulder, but to no avail. He tried to twist around so that he could kick at the doors with his feet, but there simply wasn't enough room. It occurred to the boy that if he couldn't hear much of what was going on outside the cupboard, perhaps anyone who was outside couldn't hear him. With that thought, panic began to take root. Lowell hammered helplessly on the doors with his fist, screaming for his siblings to save him. I was yelling at the top of my lungs, remembered Lowell, and inside the cupboard it was echoing, so it seemed even louder. And that's why what happened next immediately seemed unreal. What happened was that someone spoke. It was a man's voice, low and even, nearly a whisper. Yet Lowell heard it so clearly over his own clamor that he often wondered later if it had been inside his head. At the time, it seemed to have come directly from the other side of the doors. "You're trapped," the voice announced with quiet glee. "Let's see how you like hiding now." At that point, I just flipped, said Lowell. I was yelling my head off and bouncing my fists off every surface and kicking. You name it, I was even bashing my head against the doors. And I remember seeing these little flashes of light behind my eyes. I think I would have passed out in a minute or two, but then the doors opened. There was a rush of cool air from outside the cupboard, and Lowell fell out of the cubbyhole onto the rough, dirty concrete floor. He lay panting and crying at the feet of his brother and sister, who stood over him wearing expressions of confusion. Finally, when Lowell calmed himself a bit, they dared to ask some questions. "How did you get in there?" asked his sister. Lowell told her that he had just climbed in and closed the door behind him. "No, we mean how did you pull the trunk in front of the doors after you were inside," she said. I didn't know what she was talking about, Lowell later explained. I mean, how could I have barricaded the doors after I climbed in? But I looked over at my little brother, and he was sitting on his huge old trunk that my grandparents owned. And then I looked at the floor. I could see a trail cut through all the dust and garbage, where they had pulled this thing away from the cupboard. Someone had trapped me in there, and I know to this day that it wasn't my brother or sister. And if anyone else had been there, those guys would have seen them. At that time, however, figuring out the identity of the culprit did not seem as urgent as did the need to get out of the basement. All three children quickly made their way upstairs, where they had received the unexpected tongue lashing for soiling their clothes, and were ordered to wash themselves thoroughly before dinner. They said nothing to their grandparents, but from the day forward they stayed clear of the farmhouse basement on even the rainiest of days. You know, it wasn't until about 20 years later that I had any idea what might have happened, Lowell later said. I was having a couple of drinks with my dad, and I was finally telling him how much we hated those summers at the farm. I was telling him about some of the brutal punishments Grandpa would hand out, and Dad said, "Yeah, your grandfather was a tough old bird, but he was mild compared to his father." And then Dad started telling me this story about one time when he hadn't done his chores. His grandfather was looking to hand out a beating, so Dad went down to the basement to hide, he said. I hid in the bottom of an old cupboard with all the shells. You know the one I mean. I found that my throat was suddenly too dry to speak, so I simply nodded. Then I listened with a growing sense of déjà vu as Dad went on to describe what had happened. He told me that his grandfather had followed him down to the basement and saw him crawling into the cupboard. The old man figured it would be a good lesson for Dad if he was stuck in there for a little while, so he pushed something heavy up against the doors. Dad never knew exactly what it was, but I'm willing to bet it was the steamer trunk. I finally found my voice and asked Dad, "Did he say anything to you?" Dad nodded and said he told me something like, "Let's see how you like hiding now." Then he left me there for an hour. When I came out, I got a beating. Dad then changed the topic, and the matter was unofficially closed forever. We never talked about it again, said Lowell. But from then on, I knew who had locked me in the cupboard. Was it actually the ghost of Lowell's great-grandfather, or a supernatural replaying the events that had taken place decades earlier? The only certainty in this, it pays to be careful where you hide. There is no telling who or what might seek you out. This story takes place on a farm in southern Saskatchewan. Uncle Richard's Return. In the early 1940s, an 11-year-old boy named Carl was living a happy and rather carefree life on his parents' farm in southern Saskatchewan. His days were filled with schoolwork, chores, and friends. Best of all, Carl's grandparents lived on a neighboring farm along with their youngest son, Richard. Carl's Uncle Richard was in his late teens, but still seemed to be enjoying spending time with the younger boy. He would show him the best spots for fishing in the creek, and the best way to catch grasshoppers in a jar. Richard taught Carl to whistle, skate, and slide into home plate. 2 or 3 times a week, the teenager would walk the 3 miles to visit his nephew, always following the path of the railway tracks that ran between the 2 farms. If Carl knew when his uncle would be coming, he'd walk along the tracks in the opposite direction to meet him. As soon as the 2 caught sight of each other, they'd raise their hands high in a greeting. Carl's parents would often listen to the radio in the evenings to hear news of the war in Europe. His teacher spent some time at the beginning of each day pointing out places on the big map where important battles were being fought. Still, the reality of the situation never hit home for Carl until his Uncle Richard joined up and was sent overseas to fight. To the younger boy, who had never been farther away than Regina, it sounded like a terrifically exciting adventure. He was wise enough to keep that opinion to himself, though, especially around his grandmother, whose lips were set in a tight line for weeks after Richard left. Months passed, and Carl sorely missed his uncle's companionship. He paid more attention now when the old Hudson's Bay Company radio was switched on after supper, and he looked forwards to the days when the family received letters from overseas. Once there was even a letter addressed specifically to Carl. In large loopy script, Richard told the boy about the strange country he was in, and the new things he was experiencing. He wrote down a word in a foreign language and then explained afterwards that it meant hello. At the end of the letter, he promised that he would come home. He and Carl would put a map of Europe on the wall and use pins to mark all the places he had been. Carl read the letter several times and then tucked it away safely in a drawer. It was days before he realized that Uncle Richard hadn't actually written a word about the war itself. During the summer of 1944, Carl turned 12. It was a milestone he wished he could have shared with his favorite uncle, but Richard was still off fighting in the war. Carl didn't even know exactly where his uncle's company was. There hadn't been a letter in some time. The lack of communication seemed to make the family nervous, although no one had talked about it in front of the children. Once Carl had overheard his mother reassuring his grandmother, "It's a war," he heard her say, "and the mail doesn't move like regular." Carl tried to remember that himself. Although nobody realized it, he was old enough to worry too. One sweltering afternoon, when chores were done, the sky was perfect, cloudless blue. Carl decided to take a walk. The boy had no particular destination in mind and ended up following the railway tracks towards his grandparents' farm. The air above the steel rod shimmered in the afternoon heat. The occasional lazy insect hummed near Carl's perspiring, sunburned skin and was swatted away. It was peaceful and still, and Carl felt very alone in the world. But then he spotted some movement in the distance. Carl squinted at the horizon, wondering who or what was moving along the tracks towards him. He laid a hand on the rails and felt no vibration, and there wasn't the faintest noise, so it couldn't be a train. The boy wondered if it was an animal, and if he should perhaps be turning back home. While Carl considered what to do next, he kept walking forward. The distance between him and the approaching shape closed. Suddenly Carl realized that it was a man walking along the tracks. In the same moment that he realized this man raised his arm in what was to Carl a familiar greeting, the boy felt his stomach lurch with excitement. Walking was suddenly not fast enough. Carl broke into a run, mindless of the afternoon heat and the perspiration that rolled down his neck and back. His shoes pounded out a steady rhythm on the wooden ties and spit bits of gravel out behind him. The man, who could only be Uncle Richard, Carl had decided, continued to walk at the same steady pace. But it was obvious why. Despite the high temperature, he wore a full soldier's uniform, including heavy boots and a helmet. He carried a heavy pack of gear and a rifle. Uncle Richard's home, thought Carl, and he's going to show me all his war stuff. The boy ran until his lungs and head felt ready to explode with the heat. Gasping in hot breath, he slowed to a walk and wiped the sweat from his face. The soldier was closer now, and as he raised his head and looked directly at Carl, the boy was overjoyed. It was Uncle Richard. It was definitely him. Thinking of how happy and relieved his parents were going to be with the treat sweeter than candy, Uncle Richard did look tired, though. He walked with his shoulders slumped, and it seemed to take a great effort for him to put one foot in front of the other. Carl realized that he would be needing a good long rest, and saw no reason why it couldn't start immediately. "Uncle Richard," he shouted, "sit down and rest for a bit. I'll be right there to help you carry your stuff." Richard stopped walking and looked up at his nephew. He was close enough now for Carl to see the dark pockets under his eyes and the mud smeared on his face and clothing. The boy could see none of his uncle's former energy when Richard raised his arm once more in the salute that they had so often shared. When his arm dropped wearily back to his side, Richard suddenly somehow seemed as insubstantial as the heat waves above the railway tracks. Carl would remember forever that one moment he was looking at Uncle Richard, and that the next moment he seemed able to look through him, and the moment after that he was gone. The boy felt a wave of nausea and sat down hard on the ground. The sun still beat down, the air remained still, and the bugs chirped and buzzed as though nothing had happened. It was quite some time before Carl felt capable of walking home. When he finally did, he went directly into the house and told his mother that he had had too much sun. The woman took one look at her son's hectic appearance and agreed. Carl spent the rest of the afternoon in his darkened room with a cool cloth over his eyes. The damp flannel felt refreshing, but did nothing to block out the image that had been burned into Carl's mind. It was the image of Uncle Richard, weak and worn, raising his arm in one final friendly salute. Days later, Carl's grandparents received the telegram. Richard had died in battle. It had happened on the day that Carl met him on the tracks. The family grieved and eventually healed. Carl grew older and dealt with his loss by learning as much as he could about the war. By himself, he hung a map of Europe on his bedroom wall and pinpointed the places his uncle was likely to have been. Years after his strange experience, when Carl was older than Richard ever got to be, he came across the letter that his uncle had sent him. The foreign word that had been unrecognizable to Carl as a boy was now obvious and easy. It was bonjour. Richard had been in France when he wrote to his nephew. It was a small discovery, but one that allowed Carl to feel closer to his uncle than he had since the last day he saw him, the day the young man had died, and had come home to wave farewell by the railway tracks. This story takes place in Kinserlee, Saskatchewan. Phantom Post. Sandra, who grew up in Kinserlee during the 1970s, enjoyed a particularly close relationship with her aunt. The two lived hundreds of miles apart, but that never kept them from being in close communication. I probably wrote 2 or 3 letters a week to Auntie Bev, recalled Sandra. I'd just tell her about all my teenage problems, really pour my heart out. She always wrote back, and she always had good advice for me. It was easier, you know, than going to my parents a lot of the time. Sandra's aunt must have enjoyed being the young girl's confidant, for she always encouraged the correspondence. Christmas and birthday gifts usually consisted of pretty patterned or scented stationery, colored pens, and pre-printed address labels. There were always stamps too, said Sandra, so there was never anything that kept the teen from writing. Ironically, the woman who advised Sandra through so many of life's little problems was to be the source of her greatest sorrow. When Sandra was 16, her Aunt Bev was killed in a car accident. Every member of the family grieved, but Sandra may have been the most affected by the tragedy on a daily basis. Every day I'd find myself thinking, oh, I have to ask Auntie Bev about this or that, remembered Sandra. I'd wait for her opinion or her advice. Sometimes I just wanted to tell her something like, I got a good grade, or some boy was flirting with me, when I remembered that she wasn't there to write anymore. Writing letters to Bev had been Sandra's bedtime ritual. After the woman's death, Sandra simply went to bed earlier and often cried herself to sleep. After several weeks, Sandra's parents became concerned that their normally lively daughter was not recovering from her loss. She had dark shadows haunting her eyes, and her grades had dropped. A teacher from one of Sandra's favorite classes had called to say that the girl seemed unenthusiastic and indecisive. Her level of energy and confidence seemed low. It was suggested that the girl might need some professional counseling. When Sandra's parents gently approached the subject with her, however, they met with total resistance. I just flatly refused, she later said. At the time, I wasn't sure why, but later I kind of figured it out. Auntie Bev had been my counselor, and I didn't want to replace her. Not so fast, anyway. As Sandra got ready for bed that evening, she felt more downhearted than ever. Inside, she knew that she did need to speak to someone, but she honestly didn't know if she could share her turbulent emotions with anyone other than her trusted aunt. Sandra was thinking that the situation was hopeless, and she sighed deeply as she leaned over to turn off the bedside lamp. Before her fingers touched the switch, she noticed something. Just opposite the bed in Sandra's small room was her little writing desk. It was where she had always kept her stationery and pens. After Bev's death, however, she had cleaned off the surface, stashing every item that reminded her of letter writing deep in the desk's single drawer. But on that particular night, the desktop was not cleared. 3 items sat there, very deliberately positioned. There was an envelope, 3 sheets of paper, and a lavender-colored pen. I couldn't figure it out, said Sandra. Not only were those things taken out of my drawer, but they were also taken out of the stationery box that they had been packed in. I didn't think my mom would have done it. She was really good about respecting my privacy. So it was strange. I just sat there on the edge of the bed, looking at this stuff for the longest time. After several minutes, Sandra was overcome with a tremendous urge to write a letter to her aunt. She thought about how good it would feel to unburden herself on paper, knowing the words would reach a sympathetic reader. Then immediately on the heels of that thought, she found herself thinking, well, why not? The girl sat down at her desk and gingerly picked up the writing pen. It had been a gift from her aunt the previous Christmas. She ran her fingers lightly over the creamy sheets of stationery with their tiny clustered of painted pansies on the top. Also a gift from Aunt Bev. Sandra, who had anticipated that any reminder of her beloved aunt would only be painful, was surprised to find that there was comfort in these things. She picked up the pen and wrote, "Dear Auntie Bev." After that, the words just poured out, said Sandra. I filled those 3 sheets back and front with everything that I'd been feeling over the weeks. When those pages were full, I was going to get some more paper. But then it occurred to me that 3 pages were laid out, so maybe 3 pages were all I was supposed to write. I folded them up and put them in the envelope. I didn't know how I would address it, and there were no stamps on the desk, so I just wrote Auntie Bev on the front. Then I hid it away on the top shelf of my closet and went back to bed. Sandra remembers having a deep, dreamless, and restful sleep that night. In the morning, she woke feeling better than she had in many weeks. For months afterward, Sandra wrote letters to her aunt. The stationery was never set out on the desk for her again, but that didn't matter. The idea had been planted and had taken root. The teen sometimes wrote as many as 3 letters in a week, but they were never more than 3 pages in length. Although when she finished, she would stash them away at the top shelf in her closet. That writing was just really therapeutic for me, Sandra said. After a while, I really did start to feel better. My parents stopped trying to get me into counseling, and then, eventually, I found I wasn't writing as often. Then I got to the point where I didn't have to write to Auntie Bev at all anymore. The question remains, did Sandra benefit solely from sorting out her feelings on paper, or was there a bit of supernatural help involved? I can only tell you 3 things, Sandra stated. Number 1, I don't know who set out the stationery for me on that first night. Number 2, I always felt extremely close to Auntie Bev when I was writing to her. I mean, extremely close. And number 3, when I went away to college a few years later, I couldn't find any of the letters that I had written. I know where I put them, and I'm sure that I never threw them away, but they just weren't there in the closet anymore. Perhaps the letters were delivered after all, to a woman who managed to comfort her grieving niece all the way from the other side. This story takes place in Swift Current, Saskatchewan. Photo of a phantom. A man from Swift Current named Gary never believed in ghosts until 1994. That was the year he was given an old family photo album, filled with images of relatives he knew and several he had never met. There was one, however, whom he was about to meet. When Gary first received the album from an elderly aunt, he spent several hours flipping through its dry yellow pages. He had a great interest in photography and examined each picture with care, wondering if the creases or scratches could be repaired. One portrait in particular seemed to demand his attention, although Gary could not see why. It showed a distant relative whom he had never known, posing proudly in front of a leafy hedge. The man wore a dapper 1920s-era suit with a jaunty straw hat. Beneath the brim, his dark eyes twinkled, and under a formidable mustache, the man's mouth was turned up in a merry expression. The photo had no stains or damage, and Gary could not understand why he kept returning to it. Eventually he decided that he simply found the picture appealing and put the album away without another thought. That night, Gary found himself dreaming about the photo album, with its crackling pages of black and white history. Around 3 a.m., he awoke with the image of the dream fresh in his memory. He rose to use the bathroom and stood at the sink for several seconds while he had a drink of water. When he set the glasses down, he glanced into the darkened mirror for no more than a moment and was shocked at what he saw. There, superimposed over his own face, was the jovial visage of the man whose portrait Gary had found so intriguing. Gary gasped in shock and stumbled backwards a step. In that instant, the image vanished. This is a waking dream, Gary thought to himself, with a sense of wonder. He stepped forward and gazed more intently into the mirror, but could not recreate the hallucination. Wondering once more why the mustached man held such appeal for him, Gary returned to bed and went back to sleep. He dreamed no more of the photo album that night. Several nights later, Gary, sleeping once again, when a sudden chill awoke him. Thinking that his wife had rolled over and taken the covers with her, Gary began sleepily to grope for the blankets. He found himself as well tucked in as ever. Confused, Gary opened his eyes and saw the source of the icy cold air. It was the man from the photo, standing beside his bed, staring down at him. Gary was too stunned to move. He simply stared at the apparition, who stared back at him, seemingly amused. After a moment, Gary realized that he had been holding his breath and exhaled in a jagged stream. The air that left his mouth immediately condensed into white vapor. At the sight of this, the ghost's head bobbed slightly, as if in a suppressed snort of laughter. He winked at Gary and vanished. The bedroom air began to warm almost immediately. The next day, Gary said nothing to his family of his mysterious nocturnal guest. After dinner had been cleared away that evening, however, he pulled out the old album. Carefully he laid it out on the kitchen table and turned to the page he had looked at so often. There was no doubt it was the same man. Gary resolved to speak to his aunt and find out who the fellow was. He wasn't convinced yet that he believed in spirits, but there was something going on that he couldn't explain. As Gary was about to put the photos away, his 4-year-old daughter climbed up on his lap. She pored over the pages with great interest, and became particularly excited when she saw the portrait of the gentleman by the hedge. "I know that man," she exclaimed. "He comes to visit sometimes. That's Uncle Mo." Gary placed a phone call to his office the next morning and explained that he wouldn't be in. He then wrapped the photo album carefully and put it on the front passenger seat of his car. It kept him company as he made the 2-hour drive to his aunt's home. When he got there, he showed the elderly woman the photo and asked her to identify the man. She adjusted her glasses and looked carefully at the face. "Oh, that would be Morris," she said. "He was Ruth's brother. That would make him your great-uncle, I suspect." She then turned her attention to Gary and inquired, "Why do you ask?" "No reason," he replied. Gary never told his aunt the truth and never mentioned the strange incidents to anyone else. But from that point on, he was more open-minded regarding the paranormal. After all, he knew from experience that sometimes relatives can return.